Hi, welcome to Detours Understanding Acquired Brain Injury. And with us, as you recognize, one of our returning hosts is Joyce. And we're going to have an interesting discussion tonight at something that's a challenge that occurs quite often and leads to decision making that haunts a lot of families. Welcome to 3 Days to Live, deciding to turn off life support or not. Joyce.
Thank you, Mark. It's all about money. Take stroke patients. The study from the University of Washington Stroke Center in Seattle looked at two groups of patients. 78 of them had life support and 78 of them didn't. So the researchers found that 38% of life support machines were utilized for some reasonable time period after significant recovery, and kept progressing. So how about that?
Well, it's like, I guess it would depend. I mean, because I just had completed Diana's Children, talking about brain injury survivors. And obviously, a stroke, things are different. And it depends on where it is. But it is true that given enough time, recovery can occur. And obviously, I mean, insurance and like legal questions and all kinds of things play into it. It's like, it's a complicated kind of issue to deal with. It's like, how long should a patient occupy a bed while they're unconscious? How far along that chain will they go? I mean, they're in a coma usually for about a month, and then they'll move to the next level, which is either persistent vegetative state. In fact, I'll put up that chart like I did for Diana's Children, where they're either vegetative state, persistent vegetative state, or minimally conscious state. And those can last for months or even years. And some patients never move out of those states. And we don't really know how to predict who will and who won't. And doctors can be, it's like conservative with like what they want. And that ties into another episode I did talking about why doctors, tend to be, when they do this, tend to be more conservative. They don't want to get a family's hopes up, especially when the right answer is, I don't know. And then you've got the lawyers and the insurance companies saying, come on, guys, time is money. Let's go. Because the maintaining the equipment and paying the nurses and paying the labs and like the imaging and all the technology. And it isn't just here in the States. I mean, you hear from people in other countries, it's the same problem because it's still expensive. And the question is like, if this patient's going to remain permanently in a vegetative state, then what?
But 38% of them who did who had the life support machines recovered.
To what?
Significantly.
But
so
what does
how
that
about
mean?
that?
What does that mean? But what does that
I don't
mean?
know.
That's where these studies you have to be careful about. Does it mean they were able to return to a full and complete life? Or does that mean to assisted living, which would be certainly far better than, say, being in a skilled nursing facility where somebody had to turn them, change them, feed them? Or were they able to go home again? Were they able to participate? These are the kind of questions.
All that matters. But as somebody's wife or somebody's husband or somebody's children and the cousins, and it goes on and on.
But here's the thing, for me at least, if I couldn't reciprocate for my wife Stacy, if they had a tube feed me and I couldn't reciprocate with my wife, I wouldn't want them to. I'd
Yeah.
want to be turned off.
Yeah.
Because then I'm just a burden. At
Yeah.
least that's how I view it. I wouldn't want to be just a weight, so just a shell. I mean, it's taken me a long time to come to accept being diminished, at least how I view. And each person is different. I mean, I'm not what I once was. I'm in pretty good shape considering, but I'm still not what and who I was. Can I accept where I am? Yeah, I can. But I'm certainly not who I was. And so that's a big part of it. And my wife is, she's like, well, I didn't know you before, so you're perfectly fine as you are. I love you exactly as you are. But I know a little bit. I remember I remember some things what I was like before. I certainly do. But it's like, what does it mean? I mean, how do you feel? You certainly were on longer than I was. I was only on for a very short.
Yep.
Um, so what are your thoughts?
Well, there's a greater need for less pessimism and instructing the families when to turn the life support machine off because the doctor's pessimistic and that doesn't help the family decide.
What would you want, for you? I mean, if you were it's like you were unconscious at the time, but what if it were a family member of yours?
Well, that depends which family member. But I'm not saying that in a sarcastic way, but
No, no,
it
no. I know
depends.
exactly what you mean. Each person wants something different.
Yep. For me, I'm going to want the life support machine for as long as I can have it.
Okay.
But because of the 78 patients, increased significantly. I don't know what significantly is.
That's
I
the
don't
problem.
know. Yes.
And
I thought,
stroke
yeah,
patients are different from traumatic brain injury patients. Their age profile, what the demands on them are as, members of society. Most TBI patients are young.
yeah,
Sure, they're getting older now because of, well, just the shift in the demographics and falls.
yeah.
But back when it happened to me, it was car accident victims. And the numbers of TBIs from car accidents are going up again because people there are more safety features, so they're driving their cars stupid. And now those numbers are going back up. And so if it happens to you as a traumatic brain injury victim who's motor vehicle accident or whatever, you can have decades ahead of you where you're actually more of a drag on your family financially as well as socially and emotionally. I mean, if our people with mild or moderate TBI have social and emotional problems, and they may be mean, aggressive, they may be selfish or insensitive, not intentionally, but it's part of the what happens. And so it's like you're more of a drag and a duty as opposed to a participant. And
And
it's
the Dr. Stephen Greenberg, who saw those numbers, 78 patients, said fully a third of them, patients in whom life support is withdrawn, might otherwise survive. It's staggering. It's staggering.
mm,
You find it staggering? Staggering?
mm, I don't know. I mean, like I said, stroke patients are different. They on average they tend to be older, so like demands and expectations are different, and there are more supports in place for folks who are older. I mean, they do have, and it's more, you more often will find them with, like I said, there's a lot of like the Office of the Aging
Yeah.
and like those kind of functions, as well as it's all right. There are the above 55 communities, above 60 communities. They're out there. And so it's, well, maybe not to say all right, but it is socially more acceptable. So the demands are a little different. And so, do we push? Of course, then the counter to that is, well, it's less guilt inducing if you turn grandma or grandpa off, than it is if, you turn your kid off. But at the same time, you know, the pattern of the strokes are different too. Some tend to be more like motor or strictly aphasic, where it's a speech thing and you can figure out how to work around that, whereas others are behavioral and like outcomes are harder to predict there or to deal with. It's a difficult topic. And
Yep.
there are hospitals do have ethicists, philosophers who study ethics and who can help make recommendations. But that's a big ones where you find those kind of people who can help you make those kind of decisions. And then there's clergy and stuff like that, obviously too. But those are tough decisions, and usually they want that decision pretty early and pretty quick.
Oh, yeah,
So
72 hours.
yeah,
72 hours. Yes. Yeah. And
that I'm a problem.
a study from Kansas interested me because of the nature of it. University of Kansas Medical Center for 2 years, for 2017 to
Mhm.
2019, said a number of patients were unsalvageable,
Right.
meaning
Yes.
there were 48
Yes.
hours that resulted in death, 48 hours that resulted in hospice care, 48 hours of no operative procedure, no endoscopic procedure, no radiological intervention.
Mhm.
And there were 1,241 transfers in that time, trauma transfers, and there were 18 patients that were deemed futile.
Right.
Patients in that period of time, futile and not futile, was transferred to the traumatic brain injury department of the hospital, and used it. You ever hear that injury severity score?
Of the what score? I'm sorry.
Injury severity
Oh,
score.
yes, of course. I've heard of it here.
Yes, yes,
I'll,
yes.
I'll put it up. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a validated score that correlates, for those who don't know, that correlates morbidity, mortality, and
Mhm.
the hospital stay after transfer.
Right. The research is on the injury severity scores kind of, a lot of these scores are kind of like, it's kind of like the Glasgow Coma Scale. It's not a fantastic predictor of morbidity and mortality, but it at least points towards the fact that somebody's at a higher risk of not making it, because again, each one is individual, but you've got to group people at least initially. And a lot of the insurance companies use these to make their decisions. They have computers that look at this, and actuaries. In fact, um, Julie, who's also one of our hosts, used to be an actuary for Aetna. And that was the kind of thing she did, was to look at, crunch the numbers and say, well, this, that, or the other thing. Um, and for predicting like costs and where you ran over where it just wasn't practical versus she was a statistician basically, but that's part of what their job was for your whatever insurance company, and so
Every
that.
hospital, oh, wait, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. At that time, the median cost of treating futile patients alone was $46,396, an amazing amount of money.
Mhm.
The cost of the trauma transfers, fetal transfers, will come to a cost savings of 27 million annually in the United States. In the United
Yeah.
States, who knows what other countries should do?
Well, I mean, as far as I understand, for the average family, just one, the lifetime costs of taking care of a person with traumatic brain injury or stroke Like depending, of course, and this varies from person to person, about $1.2 million for a lifetime of care. And that's just a single family taking care of a TBI or stroke survivor, all the medical care and all the like, you know. So, I mean,
Dr. Trog writes that the practice now in most ICUs is to have families make a decision within 72 hours.
right.
And that's tough. That's tough indeed.
You can't make that kind of decision. At least I don't think I could.
Yep.
Because as a family, first of all, you're in distress in those first. I mean, it's denying the humanity of the family members. They're in shock. They're not going to say, "Okay, turn them off." No, they need time to come to grips with what's happened, whether it's a stroke, whether it's a car, and depending on like, is this the primary breadwinner of the family? Is this one of your kids? Nah. I mean, what if this was like your, 18-year-old son, or if this was, mom for the family? Hell no. 72 hours? Yeah, nah, I don't think so. Um,
The only reason I'm here now is because my sons pleaded with the doctors, give her more time, give her more time. She'll come
right.
around.
Yeah,
And I did. But the sons didn't plead for me. Who knows?
yeah. Um, it, it, it's a difficult decision. I mean, I was thinking, it's like for me, like I said, I wasn't as long as you were. I was only briefly, because I was only out, in a full coma for about like a day and a half, two. And then the remaining days I was coming out. So I was in altered states. I was in an altered state for like 4 or 5 days. I was in, coma, then in an agitated, combative, delirious kind of state. Again, according to dad and stuff I remember from doctors later. But and I don't have a memory for like a long time. I'm missing like 8 weeks total, maybe something like that. I don't know. I was all gray and fuzzy, but um, yeah. So I mean, fortunately, no one pushed him to turn anything off. They extubated me pretty quickly. And I was probably on support, and there's a difference too between whether the vent is breathing all the time for you or whether it provides breath.
Yes, yes.
Or whether it breathes when you need it to, which was my situation, I'm assuming. Well, then maybe it was demand. I don't know. But in any case, that's not a hard decision for, 72 hours. Nah. And I'm curious, like people out there who may be watching this, it's like, what do you think? What are your thoughts? Is 72 hours to live sufficient for somebody to show that they're moving? Because that applies to general rehab as well. You can get thrown out of a rehab if every week you don't show progress. That is problematic too, because there are like smaller plateaus and then people move on. But if you don't keep pushing over time, people regress, patients will regress. So again, that you're right. Your statement in the beginning is right that, well, a lot of it is driven by costs, insurance companies. That's a problem.
It's a big problem. It's a big problem.
But it's a problem everywhere, not just America, because there are those who could, oh, well, it's free over here. No, it isn't. It's in your taxes. But it's still the same thing. It's driven by cost. And what is a person worth? Ooh,
What is it worth? A person worth? That's
that's really what this is about.
yeah. That's really what it's about for sure.
Oh,
How can you tell what a person is worth?
I mean, the materials were made up of or carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen is about $17 and like 68 cents, I think, altogether is what I last read. But I think you and I are worth a few more dollars than that, don't you?
Yes. Well, is the injury severity score is there anything better? After all, the doctors are in charge. The doctors are the one making the examination. So is
Yeah.
there anything better?
Well, the problem is like since we can't define, we still haven't figured out exactly what consciousness, what it is, because there are debates. We're getting better at detecting, like, again, with my previous video where I talk about Diana's children, you can see whether a person is persistently vegetative due to low glucose use in those PET scans versus whether they're maybe in minimally conscious, and whether they are moving forward, whether their brain is becoming more active. And in those cases, or if they're truly not in a coma, in the Ranchos Los Amigos scale, if they're actually at a higher state, maybe more time, or if you do a quantitative EEG, which is a computer-based EEG, or doing an evoked potential study, somatosensory or visual or auditory EP study, maybe. But again, these are sophisticated studies and are expensive to run and requires expertise to interpret. This is not something your regular radiologist does. You need a neuroradiologist who is a high specialist, highly trained specialist in radiology, and they're much harder to find. Not every hospital has them. And yes, you could, I guess, send it to one, but then there's the cost of having them read it. And then in some of these cases, you'd have to do the study every day. If somebody is, for example, you do the initial scan, like if somebody were to have a stroke or were to have a head injury, today, you do the initial scan, and if you're doing a PET scan, then you need the radioactive isotopes that go with it, which cost a fortune because they have to be made in a reactor or cyclotron, which is expensive, the electricity, the materials to make it. And it becomes useless the next day. So you've got to make it again the next day. So you've got the costs of the nuclear materials, the licensing. Then you've got to get a specialist to administer it, pay for offset the equipment. Then you have to pay the neuroradiologist to read it and interpret it, its meanings, and do it every day to see how they're doing. Same thing with the EEG, the quantitative EEG. At least you don't need radioisotopes, radiopharmaceuticals. Instead, then you're paying for the specialists who have to set the equipment up, wire the patient up, do the evoked potential studies every day to see whether there's a signal change. And there's no guarantee there's going to be, because if this person's in persistent vegetative state, they're not going to come out of it. There are experiments to awaken people, and there are new drugs which do help bring people out of these comatose states, but they don't work on
What kind of
everyone.
drugs? What kind of drugs?
Amantadine is used. It's an old antiviral drug. Dextromethorphan, intravenous variant. There bromocriptine, which is an older dopaminergic agonist. Deep brain stimulation, which is an electrical implant. But you got to crack someone's coconut open to put that inside. Direct electrical stimulation, DC stimulation of the reticular activating system. Very dangerous procedure, but maybe helps. Transcranial repeat high frequency transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses strong external magnetic fields, and you do it at a high frequency and high rapidity, with the goal of causing these neurons to switch on. There's been experimental work with an implanted chip, generates high frequency stimulation, DC stimulation of that area of the brain. So are there treatments and things to try? Sure. Are they considered experimental and not covered? Yeah. Um, the drugs, yeah, and they've shown some promise. There are programs, and again, I mentioned this in Diana's Children. There are some hospitals that have um, altered consciousness programs, where they specifically are for patients that are in these diminished states for long periods of time. There's promise. There's promise. Hyperbaric oxygen, maybe. Again, the research is uncertain. Um, this is why quitting after 72 hours, because there are some possibilities, but it depends on what imaging, what we can't just rely on the old techniques. The new stuff needs to be, implemented, new imaging, new medications, and new procedures. But another one of these problems, and people I've spoken to are like, well, they don't have anything like that around here. True. These kind of imaging techniques, these procedures, these ways of looking at things, the fusion tensor imaging, it's found at the big institutions, the major university hospitals, like places I used to work when I was down at Penn, when I worked at University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League school, Hershey Medical Center, which isn't that far from me. Big places, level 1 trauma centers. They have stuff like this, research and research hospitals, teaching hospitals. But
Who do you
you're
use them for? Who do you use them for?
what?
The research, the machines.
Oh,
Who,
it's used for
who,
brain research. A lot of it is used for neuro research, um, for to develop new techniques, new medications, things like that. But the problem is the small general hospitals and stuff can't afford. They can't afford to have a cyclotron on site. Um, for example, like one of the imaging techniques uses something called oxygen 15, which is a radioactive isotope of oxygen used in PET scanning, because that variant of oxygen, it decays in seconds. So you've got to make it immediately and on site, and the patient will consume it for imaging. But you need a device, you need a linear accelerator, a LINIAC, so you need to make it immediately. Only the biggest, largest hospitals can afford something like that. These things are gigantic, or like proton beam therapy for cancer. The cyclotron is the size of a building. You're a little out in the backwoods of Kentucky or whatever. Those hospitals can't afford that. That's university hospitals. When I worked at one of the hospitals I used to work at, there were for cancer treatment using the what was it? It was a CyberKnife. Um, there were only 26 in the country. There are only 26 of these machines in the country. We had 3 of them because we could afford it. But the devices to feed it took up underground about half of one of the buildings. And it took 2 years to put the accelerator in. This is one of the problems with a lot of the new technology. It is too damn expensive. And this ties back into the point you were making in the beginning. It's about money. If your hospital can't afford stuff like this, good luck. So it also depends on where you live. I mean, I've always been and I've always worked for large hospitals. And that also affects the doctors too, whether they hear the latest, the greatest, and the newest, whether they get paid enough. I mean, sure, there are a lot of doctors who are like dedicated to working out in the more remote areas, but a part of being plugged into the latest research. I mean, I went to school down in Philadelphia. So I learned and I was, like I said, plugged into the stuff. But unless you keep up to date and you see, you don't learn about a lot of this stuff, your knowledge gets out of date very quickly. And so you're still using techniques and knowledge that's 30, 40 years old. And I'm not knocking on any physicians. They work their asses off, just like the nurses do. And I see a lot of disrespect for the docs. The problem is again, the financial thing, the insurance companies want them to see and get through patients like that, and they're overloaded in the small hospitals. You got one place to go unless you're willing to be flown 2.5 hours. So they're between a rock and a hard place. And so it's a solution that needs fixing. 3 days to live isn't the answer. More funding.
So where do we get the funding? Where do we get the funding? The government?
That's one place, but that's not the only place. The only place is to hold accountable these insurance companies. When we are working, we need to look at how much profit taking there is, how much profit they're pulling off. The days of the HMO kind of approach, where they were taking it to profit, are kind of back, but they still take a nice chunk. So maybe we need to look at that. Docs and nurses of the total cost of a hospital are about 8% of the cost of a hospital, 8% to pay. Majority of the costs are in administration and are the so-called hotel bill, as in to pay for electricity, water, maintenance of the building. Most of the costs go into administration and maintaining the building, food. So we need to like be more critical about everyone's like, the rich doctors and the nurse and 8%.
Wait a minute, 8%?
8%. Yes.
Oh my God. That's
92% of the costs. And yes, medication's expensive and stuff, but guess what? Majority of the cost is electricity, water, housing, taxes, for like keeping the buildings clean, water, like I said, all the support stuff. That's what's expensive. Food, think about it, to feed to feed everybody, feed the patients, to cooks, janitorial staff. And I'm not knocking anyone, I'm just saying, but it's supporting all of this stuff, the paper, the pens, the computers, the wiring, all that stuff, everything, and fixing things when they break, and they break a lot because of hard use, all of that. And then administrators, redundant layers of administration to keep up with the laws and to handle and insurance, and all of that is what costs. That people
you
don't
think
think about
the CEOs are making too much?
I'm not even going to talk about that because I will probably hit the screen. But and many of them are not doctors or nurses. Most hospitals are run by a business person who, but that's not a large chunk of the cost either. Most of it is the support, and then like for construction or maintenance and all that stuff. It's expensive to run a hospital. It's expensive to run a doctor's office. Most docs and nurses don't take home as much as you think. It isn't them. It's, it is just, it's just like, and people have this, that idea is wrong.
This has been an experience. You told me many things.
I learned some things too. It was kind of interesting. And I have to reflect on some stuff too. One of my jobs at the hospital is advisory to, like, when a doc or whatever, a nurse practitioner PA would ask about brain injury, because I'm a very specialized. Nurses like me are incredibly rare. We're hyper specialized like me in brain injury only. I mean, I do have a psych background, but hyper specialists like me, very rare. And so I'm a consultant. And so, I would advise for like in those areas, but it's a lot of things to think about. And the ethical stuff is important too. So I appreciate it. And I found this an interesting discussion. kind of style. It's a little different from our usual approach to things. So, and hopefully you gain some things from this too.
Oh, yeah, many things, many
Some
things.
stuff to talk about maybe in the future when we do our next, when we do the next, and for you guys too, for your group.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Joyce. I appreciate it. And those of you out there, if you have any comments or questions, please post them below. This is a kind of an evocative topic. So please post below, email, or post below for Joyce. I'll make sure she gets them. If you have anything, any questions, please click like and subscribe. Continue watching Detours. We're working on that webpage. We will have it up sooner or later. And again, don't forget to hit that bell icon, of course, and come around again the next time for Joyce, more thought-provoking stuff. Don't forget to watch We Diana's Children, because it talks about the specifics of comas and altered states of consciousness. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.